inspired you guys get by the topic I'm going to talk about, but I want to start off by asking you a question. And it's more like a trivia question, so it's kind of a guess what's in my head answer. You don't actually have to know the answer. Just get to thinking about it. When was the first time you heard the phrase "once upon a time"? When was the first time that you used that phrase? Can you possibly imagine the first time that it was actually said in recorded history? The phrase "once upon a time" came back into the 1380s. It was actually a group of muses, artists, and dramatists. They used that phrase for the sake of keeping it simple. We'll call them jesters. It was actually an occupation that they had over in Europe to tell stories and to write them down, to remember them. Well, these groups of people, they weren't the only ones who started telling stories and writing it down using the phrase "once upon a time." Other people started using those phrases. And it became what's called a stock phrase, something that people just say. However, without them actually writing those stories down, without them actually giving us those stories to future generations, we would have no record of what they said. My topic that I'm going to talk upon is not about the stories that they told us, is not about what it was they did. Believe it or not, it's actually about the pieces of paper that they wrote on. How inspired do you guys get from looking at the newspaper each day? How inspired do you get from reading a book? When it comes to reading novels and such, how many of us has actually picked up a novel and sat down and read it just because we wanted to, not because we had to? I know that I do it all the time. As a matter of fact, I have a rather extensive, probably boring library that some of you might not want to get into. Others of you might actually really enjoy it. Everything from science fiction, fantasy, even to things like documentaries on political houses. Knowledge and entertainment that you can find in today's world is vast. Very vast. More so than any other time in the history of the world combined. Why? It started out with the advent of writing. Not the advent of the printing press, when we began mass-produced books. When we first began to take our writings off of the cave walls and to put them onto pieces of paper or pieces of wood, or whatever else we could to pass on that writing to future generations. Yet in today's world, how many of you have a book in front of you? You have a MacBook. Does that count? How many of you are using paper right now? I am. I got paper right here. 1.5 pages of kind of aggravating mental assault on paper. Paper, of all things, is actually one of the most important inventions that has ever been brought to us. Without paper, you wouldn't have those computers in front of you. Without paper, we probably wouldn't even have these chairs and stuff in front of us, or this building to meet in. Why? Because paper helps us to remember. It has helped us to invent, to create, to pass on stories to future generations. Paper, other than probably the wheel, is probably one of the greatest inventions in the history of mankind. And how often do we take it for granted? How often do you throw something that's paper in the garbage? How often do you use paper every day to write in a journal or to pass on along a note to a friend in the middle of class? I used to do that all the time. Actually, it was kind of fun. But do we actually appreciate paper? Do we appreciate the simplicity of this magnificent invention? You can do art with it, believe it or not. The Chinese version of the art called origami. It's actually art. You can do paintings with it. Some of the greatest art paintings in the history of the world are done on paper. As a matter of fact, they're all done on paper. Canvas, the walls of buildings even. But the greatest ones of them all are all done on paper, so they can be passed on from place to place, from generation to generation, for us. If you can just imagine for a second, every invention throughout the world, just throw it all out the window. Where would our world be today without this really small invention? We'd probably be back in the Stone Age. I personally am am inspired by a piece of paper. Call me pathetic. Call me